I left India at the age of 40 to help my son build a life in the United States. I worked, looked after his children, cooked, cleaned. I did everything for that family, until the day he looked at me and told me I needed to leave. I returned to India with a broken heart, trying to understand at what point I had stopped being a mother and become a burden. Months later, the phone rang. It was him, crying, alone, desperate, and for the first time in my life, I didn't know whether I should help. When my son asked me to leave the United States, I was in the kitchen preparing dinner for the family. The smell of cumin and ginger still hung in the air, and the basmati rice was resting in the pot. I remember because that was one of his favorite dishes since childhood. It always was. I thought I knew my son. I believed that for more than 60 years. But that day, I realized I no longer knew anything. He didn't shout. He didn't argue. There was no drama. It was worse than that. He spoke calmly, as if he were solving a simple problem. "Ma, I think it's better if you go back to India." I didn't understand at first. I even smiled. I thought he was talking about a trip, perhaps a short visit. I asked when he wanted me to go, if he needed help with the children that weekend, anything that made sense within the life I still believed was mine. But he just looked at me and didn't repeat the sentence. He didn't need to. It was in that silence that I felt something inside me break. My name is Meena. I am 63 years old. I was born in a small town in the state of Gujarat, where people still know each other by family name and where a mother is respected until the last day of her life. At least, that's what I believed. I came to the United States because of my son. It was always because of him. When he decided to study abroad, I sold part of my gold jewelry. I didn't tell anyone in the family how much that hurt me, because in our culture, a mother does what needs to be done. When he got his first job, I was the one who celebrated more than he did. And when he decided to marry an American woman, I accepted that too. It wasn't easy. I would be lying if I said it was. The culture was different. The food was different. The way she spoke to me. Everything felt distant from what I knew. But I stayed, because he was my son, and because I believed that, with time, I would find my place in that home. In the early years, I really did find it. I looked after my grandchildren while he worked. I cooked. I kept the house in order. In a way, I was the quiet heart of that home. Nobody said it out loud, but I knew, or at least, I thought I knew. As time passed, things began to change. Small things at first. The way my daughter-in-law avoided being in the same room as me for too long. The conversations that would stop when I walked in. The way my son, little by little, began to speak to me less and look at his phone more than he looked at me. I tried to ignore it. I told myself it was all in my head, that I was getting older, that I was being too sensitive, because accepting the truth would have been too painful in that moment, until that day in the kitchen, until that sentence spoken so calmly. "I think it's better if you go back to India." I turned off the stove without even realizing it. My hands were trembling, but I tried to hold myself together. A mother does not fall apart in front of her son, at least not the mother I had been all my life. I asked, in the firmest voice I could manage, "Why?" He took a few seconds to answer, and those seconds felt like an eternity. When he finally spoke, I realized there was no going back. "Things are difficult here, Ma." That's what he said. Simple, vague, as if those words were enough to explain what I was feeling in that moment. I waited for him to continue. I waited for him to look me in the eyes and say something that made sense, something that justified that request. But he didn't. He just crossed his arms and looked away. That's when I understood. This wasn't a recent decision. He had been thinking about it for some time, perhaps weeks, perhaps months, and I had been there every single day, inside that house, without realizing that, slowly, I was being removed from his life. I asked if I had done something wrong. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't cry. I just asked, because deep down, I still wanted to believe there was a clear reason, something I could fix. He shook his head. "It's not that," but he didn't explain what it was, and sometimes silence hurts more than any answer. My daughter-in-law wasn't in the kitchen at that moment, but I knew that decision had come from her too. I could feel it in the glances, in the gestures, in those small things no one says out loud, but which say everything. In recent months, she had become distant, not rude, something colder than that, as if I were a quiet inconvenience, a presence that needed to be dealt with. That night, no one spoke much during dinner. I served the food as I always did. I put extra rice on his plate, as I had done since he was a child, and he accepted it, as he always had. But he didn't look at me. He said nothing. It was there that I felt for the first time a loneliness I couldn't explain. I was inside my son's house, and yet completely alone. That night, I didn't sleep. I lay there staring at the ceiling, trying to understand at what point everything had changed. I thought about every choice I had made, every sacrifice, every moment I had put him above myself, and I wondered if I would have done anything differently, if I were living that life again. But the answer never came. In the days that followed, everything carried on, as if nothing had happened. And that was even harder. He went to work. My daughter-in-law managed the children's routine, and I was still there, cooking, cleaning, organizing, as if I still had a place in that home. But deep down, I knew. I had already been dismissed. I was simply waiting for the moment to leave. 3 days later, he brought it up again. I was folding clothes in the living room when he sat down on the sofa, not looking at me directly. He said he had already looked at flights, that it would be better to sort it out quickly, to avoid further discomfort. Discomfort, that word echoed in my head. After everything I had done, after everything I had left behind, I had become a discomfort. I nodded. I didn't argue. I didn't beg to stay, because in that moment, something inside me had already understood that there was no longer any space for me there. I started packing my things that same day, and that's when reality finally hit me. I didn't have much. A few clothes, a few personal belongings, a few memories. More than 20 years in that country, and everything I could take fit in one suitcase. On the last day, before leaving, I went to the children's room. My grandchildren were playing on the floor, as they always did. They didn't know what was happening. They didn't understand goodbyes like that. I knelt beside them, ran my hand through each one's hair, and smiled, because they deserved a gentle farewell, even if I was falling apart inside. My son didn't come into the room. He stayed in the living room, waiting. When I came out with my suitcase in hand, he simply said he would take me to the airport, as if it were any ordinary trip, as if I were coming back. But we both knew. I wasn't leaving by choice. I was being left behind, and for the first time in my life, I didn't know where I was truly going. The airport was crowded that day. People coming and going, embraces, farewells, reunions. And there I was, in the middle of it all, holding a small suitcase and trying to keep my composure. My son walked beside me in silence. Not a word, no attempt to turn back, just steady steps, as if he were completing a necessary task. When we reached the boarding gate, he finally stopped. He looked at me for a few seconds and said, "Let me know when you land." That was all. No long embrace, no apology, no, "I'll miss you." I nodded. Because in that moment, any word from me could have broken what little dignity I still had left, and I didn't want the last image he had of me to be that of a mother begging to stay. I handed over my boarding pass, walked down the corridor, and didn't look back. Not because I didn't want to, but because I knew that if I looked back, I might not have had the strength to keep walking. During the flight, I couldn't sleep. I kept looking out of the window, watching the lights disappear one by one, until everything turned to darkness. And it was there, in that silence, that the truth finally hit me with full force. I had lost my place, not just in that house, but in my own son's life. When I arrived in India, the heat wrapped around me like an old embrace. It was different, familiar, but at the same time, it felt like I no longer belonged there either. My town was exactly the same. The streets, the markets, the familiar faces, everything was in its place, except me. I was received by a distant cousin who still lived in the area. She welcomed me warmly, asked questions, tried to understand why I had come back so suddenly. But I didn't tell her the truth, not in that moment. I just said I needed some time, that I wanted to be close to my roots. Because admitting that my own son had sent me away was a pain I still couldn't put into words. The first days were the hardest. I woke up early, as I always had, but there was no one to care for, no routine, no need for my presence. And that was what hurt the most. For the first time in decades, I wasn't necessary to anyone. I began helping my cousin with the household chores, more out of emotional need than obligation. Cooking, cleaning, organizing. They were the only things that still made me feel useful. But even there was an emptiness I couldn't fill. At night, when everything went quiet, my thoughts would return to the United States, to that house, to that kitchen, to the moment everything changed. I wondered if he missed me, if at some point he would look at the dinner table and notice that something was different, or if his life had simply moved on, as if I had never been there at all. Days turned into weeks, and slowly I began to rebuild a routine. I started going to the temple regularly. I met other women my age. Some had stories similar to mine, though none were exactly the same. It was there that I realized something that stayed with me deeply. I was not alone. There were other mothers who had also been set aside after dedicating their entire lives to their children. Some spoke about it openly. Others, like me, were still trying to make sense of what they had lived through. With time, I began to feel something I hadn't expected. Peace. Not complete happiness, but a quiet peace. That came from acceptance. I couldn't change what had happened. I couldn't go back in time. But I could decide how to live from that point forward. And it was in that moment, when I finally began to rebuild myself, that the phone rang. I almost didn't answer. The number was international, and for a second, my heart raced in a way I hadn't felt in weeks. I answered, in silence. From the other end, I heard breathing, heavy, uneven, as if the person was trying to speak, but couldn't. And then, I heard his voice. But it wasn't the same voice that had sent me away. It was a broken voice, desperate. "Ma," that was all he managed to say. And in that instant, I knew something had happened, and that for the first time, he needed me. "Ma!" That word came through the line like a wounded whisper. It wasn't the firm tone from before, nor the distant voice that had dismissed me in the kitchen. It was fragile. It was almost childlike. I didn't respond immediately, not out of coldness, but because something inside me froze. I had spent so much time imagining that moment, thinking about what I would say if he called, whether he would apologize, whether he would explain, whether he would miss me. But when it finally happened, I didn't know what to do with it. "Ma, are you there?" His voice was trembling. I closed my eyes for a second, took a deep breath. "I'm here." There was silence on the other end. And then he began to cry. Not a restrained cry. It was deep, uncontrolled, like someone who had held everything in for too long and had finally broken. My heart tightened immediately, because no matter what had happened, he was still my son. "What happened?" I asked, trying to stay calm. He took time to answer. Between one breath and the next, he finally managed to speak. I don't know where to begin." I sat on the edge of the bed. My whole body was tense. "Start from the beginning," I said gently. More silence, and then he said something I never imagined I would hear. "She left." My mind took a few seconds to understand. "Your wife?" "Yes." His voice broke again. "She took the children." This time, the silence was mine. I felt as if the world had stopped for a moment. All those small things I had noticed, the glances, the distance, the discomfort, suddenly began to make sense in a different way. But I didn't say that. It wasn't the moment. "When did this happen?" I asked. 3 days ago. 3 days. 3 days of silence. 3 days alone. 3 days until he called me. "Why?" I asked, even knowing there might be no simple answer. He took a deep breath. "She said she wasn't happy anymore, that we were living like strangers, that I had changed." Changed. That word echoed in my mind. Yes, he had changed. I had seen it before anyone else. "And you?" I asked carefully. "Did you notice that before?" He took time to answer. "I ignored it." That hurt in a strange way, because I had ignored things too. I had ignored the signs. I had ignored the distance. I had ignored the fact that, little by little, I was being erased from his life. And now, he was experiencing the same kind of loss. "And the children?" I asked. "They're with her." His voice dropped even lower. "The house is empty, Ma." Empty. I knew that feeling. "I don't know what to do," he said, almost whispering. "I come home from work, and there's no one. No noise, no food, nothing." I closed my eyes for a moment. For years, I was that everything, and he never noticed, until he lost it. Ma, he continued, hesitantly, I need you. Those words hung in the air, heavy, loaded with meaning. I felt my heart race, but at the same time, something inside me held firm. For the first time, I didn't answer automatically. Before, I would have said, I'm coming, without a second thought. Before, I would have dropped everything. Before, I wouldn't even have waited for him to finish the sentence. But now was different. What do you mean by that? I asked calmly. He hesitated. I want you to come back. There it was, the request, direct, without hesitation. Come back. As if nothing had happened, as if I hadn't been sent away, as if that farewell at the airport had never existed. I felt a knot in my throat. Come back for what? I asked. There was a long silence. To help me, he said finally. Those two words were like a key. They opened something inside me. But it wasn't pain. It was clarity. Help you? How? I continued. He seemed confused. With the house, with the children when they come, with me. With me. I took a deep breath, and for the first time in that conversation, I felt something that wasn't sadness. It was strength. You want me to come back to manage your life for you? He didn't answer immediately, and that was already an answer. I'm lost, Ma, he said, almost pleading. I don't know how to do this alone. I closed my eyes, and for a second, I saw that little boy running around the house in Gujarat, calling for me, depending on me for everything. But he was no longer that boy, and I was no longer the same person either. I stayed silent for a few seconds after he said he was lost. From the other end of the line, I could hear his breathing, heavy, uneven, full of anxiety. It was strange how, even without seeing him, I could feel exactly what he was going through. Throughout my entire life, I had learned to recognize every nuance of my son. But this time, there was something different. He wasn't just sad, he was unraveling, and for the first time, without anyone to hold him together. Ma, please say something, he said, his voice lower now, almost afraid of my response. I opened my eyes slowly. I looked around the simple room where I was staying at my cousin's house. The open window let in the distant sound of people talking in the street, the smell of spices drifting from some nearby kitchen. Life happening simply. There, I had found a certain peace, not perfect, but real. I'm thinking, I replied, and it was true, because that decision was not a small one. It wasn't just about going back or not. It was about everything I had lived through, everything I had felt, who I had become after being left behind. You don't want to come back? He asked, with a tone that mixed fear and disbelief. Before, that question wouldn't even have existed. But now, it was there, and that said a great deal. It's not that simple, I said calmly. He sighed, frustrated. For me it is, Ma. I need you. I closed my eyes again. And this time, a memory came with force. The airport. Him standing there, distant. Let me know when you land. No embrace, no emotion, no genuine look. That memory still hurt, but it no longer broke me the way it once had. Now, it gave me strength. When you asked me to leave, I began in a steady voice, that also seemed simple to you. From the other end, silence. A different silence, heavy, carrying something he didn't yet know how to name. It wasn't like that, he tried to say. It was exactly like that, I interrupted, without raising my voice. You made a decision, without asking how I felt, without trying to understand what that meant to me. He didn't respond, and for the first time, I realized he was truly listening, not just waiting for his turn to speak. Ma, he began, more quietly. I'm not saying this to hurt you, I continued, but you need to understand. My voice didn't waver, and that surprised me, because inside, I still felt. But now, I also thought. I left my entire life to be with you, I said, and slowly, I became invisible in your home. The silence returned, but this time, it wasn't empty. It was reflection. I noticed, I continued, but I chose to ignore it, because you were my son. My breathing deepened. And then, one day, you decided I was no longer needed. From the other end, a sound, a restrained cry. I was wrong, he said, almost inaudible. I closed my eyes. That sentence had taken so long to arrive, but now it didn't carry the same weight I had imagined it would, because it didn't erase what had happened, but it opened a door. "Yes," I said softly. "You were." He began to cry again, and this time I didn't stop him. I let him, because there were things he needed to feel, just as I had needed to. "I thought I was doing what was best," he said between tears. "The house was tense. She complained, said there was no space, that we didn't live like a couple." I listened, without immediate judgment. "And you chose to resolve that by removing your mother from the equation," I said. It wasn't an accusation, it was a fact, and he felt that. "I didn't think it through," he admitted. "No," I agreed. "You didn't." More silence. But now, something was shifting. "And now?" I asked. "Do you want me to come back? Because you miss me? Or because you need help?" The question hung in the air, and I knew his answer would say everything. He took his time, much longer than before, and that was a good sign, because he was thinking, truly thinking. He began, and stopped. He took a deep breath. "I miss you." My heart tightened, but I remained firm. "And?" More silence. "And I need help." There it was, the whole truth, without masks, without shortcuts, and for the first time, he was honest. I opened my eyes. I looked at my hands, aged, marked by years of care, of giving, of silent love. And then, I understood something with a clarity I had never had before. I could love my son, without abandoning myself. I could help, without erasing myself. I could be present, without becoming invisible again. "I'm not coming back right now," I said, calmly. From the other end, absolute silence, as if time had stopped. "But," I continued, and I felt the immediate change in his breathing, "I'm not going to abandon you." Those words were different from anything I had ever said before, because this time, they didn't come from obligation. They came from choice. "You're going to learn to be on your own," I said. "You're going to learn to look after your home, to deal with your own life, with your own feelings." My voice was steady, but not hard. "The pain you're feeling is part of that." He didn't interrupt, and that showed how much he was taking in. "I'll be here," I continued, "to talk, to guide you, to listen." I took a deep breath, "but not to take control of your life again." From the other end, a long, deep exhale. "I understand," he said after a few seconds, and for the first time, I believed he truly did. "Not everything, but the beginning. You can come and visit me," I said. "You can bring the children when it's possible." My voice softened, "But this time, we're going to build something different." Silence. And then, one word. "Thank you." Simple, but true. I felt something settle inside me. Not complete happiness, but balance. After a few minutes, the call ended. I put the phone down beside me and sat in silence. The world around me was the same, but I was not. For the first time in my life, I wasn't just a mother. I was me, and that changed everything. The phone was still in my hand when the call ended. The dark screen reflected my face, older, more tired, but somehow more aware than ever before. I sat still for a few minutes without moving. His words still echoed in my mind. "I miss you. I need help." Throughout my entire life, those two things had always come together. For me, loving had always meant serving, caring, disappearing. But for the first time, I had chosen differently, and that should have brought me complete peace. But it didn't, because there was something small, that didn't fit. Something that had begun as a faint feeling, almost imperceptible, and which slowly grew inside me. I couldn't explain exactly what it was, but I knew my son. I knew the way he spoke, the pauses, the silences, and there was something in that call that didn't feel whole, didn't feel real. I got up slowly, walked to the window. The street was quiet, as always. Children playing, people talking, the distant sound of a motorcycle passing by. Everything normal. But inside me, it wasn't. I went back to the bed and picked up the phone again. I looked at the number. International. Yes, but something bothered me. I opened the call history. I stared at the digits for a few seconds. And then, I noticed. The country code was the same, but the area code was different. Not the city where my son lived. My heart jumped. Maybe he was somewhere else, I thought. Maybe he had traveled. Maybe. But something inside me already knew. I called the number back. It rang once, twice. On the third, someone answered, but it wasn't him. Hello? It was a woman's voice, young, unknown. My whole body went rigid. Who is this? I asked, trying to stay calm. There was a pause. Who are you? The woman replied, cautious. My heart began to beat faster. I'm the mother of... And I said my son's name. Silence. A heavy silence. And then, the answer came. I think there's been a mistake. The room seemed to spin for a second. This number belongs to the hospital. Hospital. The word landed like a weight on my chest. Hospital? I repeated, barely finding my voice. Yes, this is the reception desk. My hands began to tremble. My son. He called from this number a few minutes ago. More silence. And then the woman changed her tone, more serious. Ma'am, what is his name? I told her. And this time, there was no hesitation in the response. Yes, he is here. My heart stopped for a moment. He was admitted 3 days ago. 3 days. Exactly the time he said he had been alone. But he was conscious. He spoke to me. My voice began to fail. From the other end, silence. And then, the sentence that changed everything. Ma'am, he fell into a coma the following day. I felt my legs give way. I sat down on the bed without realizing it. What are you saying? The woman's voice softened. He was in an accident. He arrived in a critical condition, and since then, he hasn't woken up. The phone almost slipped from my hand. My mind began to race. The call, his voice, the crying, the words. None of it made sense. That's not possible, I whispered. I spoke to him just a little while ago. From the other end, silence. A silence that didn't explain, didn't deny. It simply existed. Ma'am, no one used this phone to make calls today. Only the staff. My heart pounded. Are you certain? I asked desperately. Absolutely. The air felt heavier, harder to breathe. Can you come here? She asked, carefully, but I barely heard. Because in that moment, everything inside me was returning. His voice, the way he spoke, the pauses, the crying, and above all, one thing I hadn't noticed before. He never answered certain questions directly. He avoided details, as if he wasn't truly living through that moment, as if he was caught somewhere between worlds. I gripped the phone tightly. My mind searched for a logical explanation, but none came. None made sense. Until one last memory surfaced. The way he said, "The house is empty. The house is silent. The house has no one." I closed my eyes, and for the first time, I felt a chill run down my spine. Because perhaps he wasn't talking about the house. Perhaps he was talking about himself. Ma'am? The voice on the other end called. But I didn't answer, because in that instant, something inside me simply understood. That call wasn't an ordinary request. It wasn't just a son asking for help. It was one last effort, one last attempt, one last connection, before disappearing completely. A tear ran down my face, but this time, it wasn't only pain. It was something deeper, stranger, harder to explain. I pressed the phone to my chest and whispered, even knowing he couldn't hear, "I'm here." The silence answered, but somehow, it didn't feel empty. And that night, for the first time since I returned to India, I didn't sleep alone, because somewhere between what is real and what we cannot understand, I felt it. He hadn't gone yet, not completely. And perhaps the choice I made, not to go back, not to lose myself again, wasn't only about me. Perhaps it was exactly what he needed to hear before letting go.